Welcome to the Successful Nonprofits Podcast. I'm your host, Dolph Goldenberg. Listeners, today our guest, Sridhar Prasad, is one of the top experts on nonprofit strategy, philanthropic markets, and has recently dived into the world of big bet grant awardees. Don't just take my word about his expertise. You can go to the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which, as we all know, is kind of the gold standard for our industry, and read his 3 articles. Now, just wait until you hear just a little bit about Sridhar's resume. He's currently a partner in the Bridgespan Group's Boston office. Now, he's worked with a number of nonprofits, foundations, and philanthropic collaboratives. These include the Women's World Banking, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Lever for Change, and the Audacious Project. Much of his work has focused on building successful platforms that harness and direct philanthropic capital to high-impact organizations. Now, prior to Bridgespan, Sridhar worked for another group that you have probably heard of, and that's the Boston Consulting Group. Hey, Sridhar, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dolph. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, on your Stanford Social Innovation Review article that is entitled Becoming Big Bettable, I have to admit that before I read the article, the phrase big bettable was not one that I thought a lot about. So can you share with myself and also with our listeners, what exactly is big bettable?
Sure, Dolph. And first, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to be with you and with all of your listeners. For us, we would define big bettable as organizations that have the capacity to both attract and deploy large philanthropic gifts. And we've defined that in prior research as gifts of over $10 million in size. For us, the $10 million mark is not necessarily a hard and fast rule. It could be 15, it could be 20. We picked a number that felt big and robust enough. And truthfully, our take is that big bets matter, that it's a heck of a lot easier to address some of the large social change challenges that many of our friends are trying to address with larger gifts. And too often, the reverse is true. We're expecting the social sector to create powerful transformational change, and revenue models are made up of nickels and dimes. And so part of our work at Bridgespan over the past few years has been to both understand the landscape of big bets and understand what it would take to unlock more big bets and unlock more philanthropy. That's what I look forward to getting into more over the next 20 minutes.
That's really awesome. And when you said, where too many organizations try to make their mission work with nickels and dimes, what I immediately thought of was, and I know you're going to want to slap me for this, Sridhar, but what I immediately thought of was the March of Dimes, which was founded to combat polio. And the whole point was mail in your dimes, mail in your dimes. Of course, a dime was worth a lot more in 1948 than it is today. But still, that was their entire campaign was, hey, march your dimes into our office. We're going to take care of polio in the U.S.
Well, and to be clear, that there are many, many organizations which have built extraordinary missions and extraordinary enterprises on the back of small dollar fundraising and mass market fundraising. And that is, one, just an extraordinary gift. And the organizations that are able to harness that and deploy that for mission, they are exceptional organizations. It's also, from our experience, more the exception rather than the rule. And especially the more and more, and we deal with a lot of organizations for whom philanthropy and foundation funds are a core part of their revenue models. With those organizations or organizations which really depend on major donor gifts for their fuel, I think the rule is much more so that the bigger the check size, the more that you can think about deploying towards impact. And frankly, from a philanthropist perspective, it is hard to meet your ambitions without a corresponding commitment in size to your aspirations.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting. I actually do talk a good little bit about eradication of polio on this show, in part because I'm a Rotarian and, Rotary Rotary went big and bettable in the 80s and 90s saying we're going to eradicate polio and has kind of been snowballing it ever since, bringing on the World Health Organization. And, it's funny because, as you know, the Gates Foundation, signed on and said, yeah, we're going to commit major money, in the B billion range, not the M million range, to bet on this because we think this is big and bettable.
Yeah, it's one of the more extraordinary philanthropic achievements of the last few decades.
So I've got to ask you, because I know in the SSIR article, you kind of have this great anonymous quote where someone's like, if I could just get lunch with Bill or Melinda Gates, I know they would get this. And part of the reason I smile about this is I don't work with a lot of 25 million and I don't think I've ever worked with a $100 million organization. So in my own practice, I don't work with a lot of $25 million organizations. I do work with a lot of million, 2 million, 5 million, $250,000 organizations. And it's interesting because I often hear people say that. I often hear people say, but you can shift it for your city. So, if we could only get in front of Bill and Melinda Gates, if we could only get in front of Bernie Marcus, who's Home Depot, I hear that all the time. And can you say a little bit about, how organizations position themselves in such a way that one day they might get in front of a Gates or a Marcus or a blank?
Yeah. So I think we note a couple of things from our research. The first is that it is rare for the first gift that a philanthropist gives to any organization to be a big bet. It happens without question. But the research that we've gone through, and the article talks about the elements of what we think about a big bettable prospectus. In some ways, the audience for those prospectuses are most likely your existing donors. But a donor who may have the giving potential to give 10x or 20x what they're giving right now to the organization, but they just haven't conceptualized the organization that way. Part of it is that, I think in the article and in many of our discussions, we think about the way in which social change has to market itself in a donor marketplace, if you will, versus large-scale institutions, hospitals, colleges, universities, so on and so forth. And the work that we do is often more intangible. It is more difficult to wrestle down into a quote-unquote product. I think that's a good thing because I think that means that we're taking on more complex challenges. But I also think that means it's a lot harder for a donor to really understand both what you are trying to achieve as well as what it would take to achieve that goal. And so, part of it is how can we bring a bit more refinement to a prospectus or to laying out the story for an organization such that that particular organization can go from being the 10th most important cause or the 20th most important cause for giving philanthropists to in their top 5. Because it's when it gets to be in someone's personal top 3 or top 5 that they then decide to make a much deeper commitment, both in terms of dollars and it's time and treasure that they're willing to give. And that combination is when philanthropy, we think, can be at its best.
I will say it's funny that you say that because I have certainly worked with organizations and I kind of work all over the country, but I'm based out of Atlanta, and I've certainly worked with organizations that, that frankly have received some of those initial small bets from their local philanthropists, whether that's, Arthur Blank or Bernie Marcus or, Bob and Renee Parsons, if you're in the Phoenix area. And I think you're right. They kind of make those bets just to kind of gauge where is this organization at. It allows them to be able to look under the hood and really get a sense of, is this organization using our funds well? And, or do we feel like we're getting the impact that we want when we make this relatively, and again, everything's relatively smaller gift for them?
That's right. I mean, our research would indicate that when an organization receives a $10+ million gift, and again, we define a $10 million gift as a multi-year gift, and so it might be $2 to $3 million a year, something like that, which is still a very substantial amount for the vast majority of nonprofits in this country. But it's typically the 4th or 5th gift that's coming from that donor, and the big bet itself is often a commitment that is 5 to 10 times what the previous commitment was. So it is in some ways, how do you, if that person's already in the door, they already have some level of trust, but now how do you lay out the story in such a way to create a step up? And That's in some ways why the elements of what we laid out in the article of what makes for a potentially successful big bettable prospectus, or a big bet prospectus rather. Well, it's an attempt to try to connect. I think we've done a lot of research on the amount of big bets that exist, and frankly the paucity of big bets in social change. The article is, I think, an attempt to say, well, how do we address this not just from the donor side, where I think there's some real conversations that have to be had, but from the doer side of what is it that nonprofits could do to potentially be more, again, to use the first phrase that you used, big bettable.
I appreciate you saying that that's the first phrase I used. My friend, that's your phrase, and that's a great phrase. So let me ask you, so if you're a small $500,000 or $1 million organization, probably, frankly, at that point, don't feel so small because you started as a $10,000 organization. But, if you're a $500,000 or $1 million organization, and the local philanthropist in your city, regardless of the size of your city, makes what for them is a big bet. Maybe it's a $50,000 gift or a $100,000 gift. What are some of the things that organization needs to do to really help cement that relationship and ensure that they get the second, the third, the fourth gift that maybe is 5x or 10x?
Yeah. So I actually think that the elements of a big bettable prospectus that are laid out in the article are in many ways not conditional upon a $10 million gift, but are core questions that I think any rigorous philanthropist is likely to ask. And so it's useful to think through those elements of, to what degree can you answer those questions in an affirmative way or in a way that gives clarity to that donor on your strategic intent, your strategic aspirations, and what you want to achieve. So in the article, we list out 5 elements, 2 of which nonprofits generally are really strong at capturing, 3 of which may be different. The first is thinking through what's the compelling problem that you're trying to address. And this we're pretty good at. We're pretty good at describing the magnitude of the challenges that we as organizations in the sector are trying to address. The second we describe as what is the point of arrival that a particular gift is going to contribute to. And that is not a 1-year landing point, but it's also not a 20-year vision. It's something in the a 5 to 10 year based if you receive this gift and corresponding gifts, what will the world look like? What meaningful change will happen that's paired with that problem that you just laid out? The third element we'd say is, what's the credible path to achieving that point of arrival? Have you thought about what is necessary to get to that landing spot and all of the elements that are required to do so? The fourth would be why philanthropy. And I think, nonprofits have a number of different funding options. Philanthropy is one powerful one, but there are imperfections in it, or rather there's reasons to use philanthropy and there's reasons not. And to be able to articulate the donor's role in this journey is probably pretty helpful. And the fifth is why this team, why this leader in this team, which again, I think nonprofits generally have exceptional leaders and teams. We are fortunate and blessed to be able to work with so many of them. And so that's usually an area of strength as organizations think about themselves and think about describing their activities. But those questions or those themes, we lay it out as part of a successful big bet prospectus, but I think they are universally applicable. And the sharper organizations can be around some of those kinds of questions, the more they may be answering donor needs, or rather might be positioning themselves in such a way that a donor can see giving to their local nonprofits the same way they give to the local university or hospital, which too often the balance is tilted on that equation.
Right. So among those 5, is there one that you think local nonprofits have the most difficult time kind of describing, laying out, and making the case for?
Yeah, I'd say it's in some ways it's a combination of the first 3, but I'd probably point to the point of arrival and the credible path if you take those as a combination. And that's in part because what the incentive structure in the sector is not to often pull up and think about where are we going? How are we actually meaningfully changing the problem, attacking the problem in a meaningful way, especially if you're in human services or something where the need is so great and you are spending every moment in service in a meaningful way. There's a little bit of a chicken and the egg challenge here, which is what big bets in some ways allow organizations to do is to exactly pull up. It's to give a little bit of that cushion and breathing room to then be able to say, well, what could we do? How could we go from serving to solving, or going in that equation in some ways? And yet, some bit of that thinking is probably required to be able to get that gift that allows you to pull up in the first place. And so that is, I think, the challenge. But I think absent articulation of how a particular donor gift changes both the trajectory of an organization and the trajectory of a problem, it's tough to see, just in our experience, those kinds of sizable commitments happening. And so that's probably the hardest strategic challenge or strategic question to solve. And I'd say the most important.
And how typically do organizations make that shift? And I love that phrase, from serving to solving, from saying, okay, we're doing a great job of service, but what are we going to do differently? And how are we going to operate to actually solve the issue? Like, what do organizations do to successfully make that transition?
I think often a number of things. I mean, the first is, and you're asking a strategy consultant all about strategic planning. And so to some degree, you get a little bit of the answer of it's helpful to have a strategic plan. It's helpful to think through some of those kinds of questions. We are in the service business. We support and help empower and accelerate our clients, and we're thrilled to be able to do that kind of work. I do think there's a healthy, burgeoning industry of people who help nonprofits get some of the time and space to be able to think about those kinds of questions. The one thing I'd say is the phrase, in some ways, from serving to solving, sometimes sounds like you're denigrating the vast sector of our social sector, which is in the serving business because we have to meet basic human needs. And I wouldn't want that to be the interpretation from our discussion, which is that is a vital part of civil society. It is a vital part of what is needed. And frankly, there's a supplement. We put a supplement out about Big Bettable, of which the article we wrote is one article. But David Callahan of Inside Philanthropy in the supplement basically says, there's a ton of work and service that people just need to fund. We'd agree with that. 100% we'd agree with that. And I think there is in some ways, and we have been at the point of this, and I think our language is probably becoming more nuanced, which is philanthropy needs to be strategic. Philanthropy also needs to be responsive. Mm-hmm. So both of those things are important. I think that what you do get is organizations which are in the serving business, which then say, what are the lessons that we're learning from the service that we've done, that then indicate what kind of structural systemic changes are needed and how do you shift from that. We've been fortunate to get to know an organization called the Bail Project, which has a fascinating model of just basically using philanthropic funds to pay for cash bail. And so that's a basic service function, which is there's a bunch of people who are in pretrial detention. You're using philanthropic dollars to bail them out. And the outcomes are radically better once someone is not waiting for trial in jail versus not. Okay. Well, the shift that they themselves are making is, what kind of data are we learning from all of the people that we're bailing out? How do we use that data to empower the field to move from just bailing people out to creating a system where bail is far more equitable / maybe doesn't exist? How do we create a justice system that is far more equitable? How do you change the conversation in some ways? To me, that's the epitome of rooting your work in the day-to-day reality that you do, and then almost synthesizing from that into how do we change basic systems given that work.
And so, Sridhar, I have to share with you, in some way, I feel a little bit validated in everything you just said. As a consultant, I do a little bit of strategic planning, and I typically vet prospective clients pretty carefully. I'm pretty clear about the types of projects I want to work on and those that I don't. And one of the things that I often kind of vet for, and I say this, I don't facilitate what I refer to as 5% strategic plans. And those are the plans where an organization's like, well, over the next 3 years, we want to do 5% or 15, whatever. Like if you're a soup kitchen, we want to serve 15% more people at the end of 3 years. Cause I'm like, you can figure out how to do that without me or anybody else. You just have to, sit down as an organization and figure it out. So it's interesting you say that, because for me, planning is all about how are we going to look at our mission and what we're trying to accomplish and figure out how we can exit, whether that's double it, triple it, or even change the equation and at some level eliminate the problem. So it's like, like if you're a food pantry, wouldn't it be just incredible if you had a 10 or 20 year goal of eliminating hunger or food deserts or whatever in the neighborhood that your food pantry is serving, as opposed to we want to serve 12% more people in the next 3 years. So it's funny because for me, like a lot of that is that, and I agree with you. I think, I started life as a case manager and I get that serving is really important. But if that's all we're doing is serving, at some level, we're not solving the problem. And we're kind of saying, hey, we're happy just being in a service role and not being concerned about how to actually fix this issue. It's kind of like being a firefighter that never actually wants to put the fire out.
Yeah, and it's an interesting pair if you think about that question about what's the role of philanthropy within your given organization, because one of the criticism of philanthropy that I think is warranted is donor gifts are time limited often. It is not some donor gifts are recurring revenue, but as many of your listeners are probably know, whenever they're going through donor renewals or grant renewals, those are not slam dunks. I think part of that's because philanthropists often look at their giving as either growth capital or something that can create a step change evolution within an organization in some ways. And so if you meet that idea, if you say, I have my recurring revenue streams and I have sort of a recurring funding model, but for this donor who's looking to make a growth capital investment in me, what would that look like? What are the kinds of potential possibilities that would open? That in some ways, the questions you're asking in some ways meet with what philanthropy can sometimes be good at, which is providing that infusion to potentially, as you mentioned, change the question.
I could not agree more. And in my experience in working with some of the high value philanthropists, they also are really good at maybe thinking about the importance of changing the question as well as actually, frankly, and it is kind of amazing what a 45-minute meeting with someone who has over the course of their career earned $1 billion, built a business that's earned $1 billion. It's amazing like what 45 minutes of free consulting with that philanthropist will do for you.
Yes.
So as we're thinking about Big Bettable, are there other things that nonprofits should be thinking about as they're considering how to make themselves big and bettable and how to approach philanthropists with the ability to really make those cause-changing gifts?
It's an interesting question because in some ways I think about the questions that are within the Big Bettable article, getting to what's your point of arrival, what's your critical path, what's the credible pathway to get there. Those are some pretty big questions, right? That's a hard, kind of meaty questions. And so I'm loath to add more to the list in some ways or add more to the plate versus actually getting really clear about these questions of almost strategic intentionality in some ways. But I do think that there's probably a number of things folks could do. But if I was to distill what we've been learning, limiting it to, in some ways, who amongst my current donor base can I harvest, and how do I approach them with a proposal or a prospectus that is more refined and more tailored to what they may be expecting / what they often may get from other kinds of nonprofits that are soliciting their support. I'm not sure I'd want to overcomplicate it more than that in some ways, or I'm not sure I'd want to add more than that to that basic action plan. I think if that doesn't work, then there's a broader conversation. But that to me feels like the first steps to being able to get on that trajectory in some ways.
And so what does that proposal look like? Since you just said, hey, this is a pitch or a proposal that is not your typical proposal. It's not what this philanthropist is getting from every other organization that is working on that cause nationally or locally.
In many ways, and the background for some of the research is important. And I want to just name a bit of data in many ways, because that data is the burning platform that we think about at Bridgespan. And then I'll come back to the proposal piece. So the reason we care about this deeply is 2 data points, I'd say. One is the paucity of big bets that exist right now. So we did a piece of research a few years ago where we looked through every public statement made by the giving pledgers on, every giving pledger has to write a statement of what they want to do with their giving pledge. And we looked at other press articles, and we noticed that the vast majority of donors list social change objectives, things like polio, malaria, after-school education, climate change, protecting democracy, criminal justice, et cetera, in their top 1, 2, 3 priorities. And then we looked at every gift that was made of over $10 million over, I think, a 10-year period. And 80% of those gifts went to sort of institutions or to not social change causes in some ways. Now, we tried to be as generous as we could with that data set. That 80-20, 20-80 aspiration gap effectively was what emerged for us. The second data point that gives us a burning platform is that we are probably on the verge of one of the greatest generational wealth transfer in certainly American history, potentially world history, given the compounding of wealth and all the dynamics that are in the news quite frequently about the composition of our society. Absent organizations being able to, I think, credibly articulate what they can do to address some of these meaningful social problems, the incentive is for all that capital to basically go to where it's been going to date. So either it doesn't get gifted at all, or if it gets gifted, it goes to large institutions that do remarkable things with that capital, but where it's hard to say the incremental social value for organizations that have endowments that are 1, 5, 10, 20, 30, $50 billion and so on. So that's the context in some ways. That's the burning platform for Bridgespan, why we care about this as an issue, as a topic, particularly considering our own mission and our deep desire to accelerate and enable social change makers. So the question becomes, well, how do you then, what does make you distinctive? And again, part of the challenge is there's a million nonprofits in America. So if you again come from the donor perspective, what becomes hard for you as a donor is, where the heck do I pick? How do I know who's good? How do I know where to give my money? I effectively end up giving to nonprofits that are supported by my friends or who throw fancy galas or things like that, right? There's a disconnect between the importance of the problem, the credible path for the credibility of the solution, and the path to get there, the point of arrival and the path to get there, and the gift itself. So our focus on these elements as part of a big bettable prospectus, our focus on, and I don't think it's a form question, I think it's really meaningfully addressing those questions and elevating those questions, is in some ways, how do you create the dynamics such that someone who deeply cares about an issue can look at your program and say, I get it. I get how it's going to make a meaningful impact against this important problem I care about. I get how you're going to do it. I get why you need me and what you need my dollars for, and I believe in this team. Okay, now let's get to work. That in some ways is why those elements that we've distilled in the article just keep popping for us, because it's a pathway to be able to, frankly, rationalize this market, to be able to close that aspiration gap.
I love that. And I also think that's somewhat helpful. I know lots of us in the nonprofit sector, when we open up the Chronicle of Philanthropy and we see the front page and Harvard got another $1 billion, we're like, really, Harvard? What do you need with another $1 billion? So that's incredibly helpful. Thank you. I want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time for our off the map question, Sridhar. In reading your bio, I noticed that throughout your career, you have moved around the country. So you've lived in lots of cities, but I'm also aware that you've always considered Boston your home. Could you tell us what it is about Boston that's kept you coming back and why you call it home?
So I actually moved to Boston from the New York, New Jersey area. My parents are still in New Jersey. In many ways, my emotional home will always be New York City. So it's funny landing in Boston, given that. My Derek Jeter jersey is in my closet. Doesn't get used much, but it is still in my closet out of pride. The Yankee had a little more so. It's funny that way. I do, my feelings about the city were probably different when I came here the first time for school versus now. But, it's this welcoming, vibrant, walkable city that I now love. And it is now home in a very real sense. My wife and I were fortunate to have our first child a few months ago. And, we live in an area where if you walk for 15 minutes, you're in the middle of Cambridge, and it's as vibrant as sort of intellectually, culinary wise, culturally wise, as vibrant as anywhere else I can think of. And we've still got a bunch of parks and lots of green space and things that we can also enjoy. So we're incredibly blessed to be where we are, incredibly fortunate. And so I love it for that balance that it seems to have, which I think I appreciate more now than in decades past, or years past, rather.
That's so awesome. And I lived in the opposite direction of New York City. And so for about 7 or 8 years, I called Philadelphia home. And I loved it for a lot of the same reasons. It was like, it was walkable. It was vibrant. There was a lot of culture. I could get to the city when I needed to get to the city, but I could have a really great life. And so I get that. I totally get that.
And my own emotional baseball loyalties would lead me to say I'm a proud Bostonian, and let's go Yankees.
That's awesome. I will share with you that if you live in Philly, you have no choice but to root for the home teams because you will be pelted with beer bottles and other things if you do not root for the home team. I do have to say that. Like I was living there the year the Phillies won the World Series. I think that was 08 or 09. And I really remember thinking, if my little row home does not burn down tonight, it is going to stand for another 125 years. So I hear you. Boy, do I ever hear you. Sridhar, I am, again, just so grateful and thankful that you've joined us today. I want to make sure that people know how to get in touch with you and know how to find out more about some of the work that you're doing. So you've written many articles that cover today's topics. And so I know that folks can go to ssir.org, which is the Stanford Social Innovation Review. We will actually link to the Becoming Big Bettable article. It's kind of a long URL, so we're not going to read it out here, but we will link to that. We also want to make sure, listeners, that you check out bridgespan.org so that you can see the vast collection of their useful resources to help your nonprofit think through strategy and how to best position yourself for those meaningful, big, bettable philanthropic gifts. Now, in particular, I also want to highlight on behalf of Bridgespan that they've got this amazing big bettable tool that is free to download. This tool will take you through step by step on how your organization can prepare to make good use of your big bet. So make sure you check that out as well. And that's actually at bridgespan.org. Once again, it's kind of a long URL. When I say kind of, I'm looking at it now. It's about 3 lines long. So we will link to that in our show notes as well. Hey, Sridhar, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Dolph. Really appreciate it.
If you're thinking through your big bet, then keep thinking. There's no need to try to scribble down long URLs. You can get all of the links mentioned in today's episode at successfulnonprofits.com. Now, as you probably know, like Sridhar, I place a high value on nonprofit strategy. From my experience helping nonprofits all around the country, it is the determining factor in your organization's success, and therefore, quite frankly, the type of impact and quality of impact that you can make depends on how well you're doing strategy. And it's one of the reasons why I feel like our conversation today was just so critical. Now, while we're talking about big bets, there is one more bet I would like for you to take, dear listener. And here's the bet I want you to take. Subscribe to our weekly email list. It is a bet with a guaranteed payoff, as you'll get a link to our weekly blog, nonprofit meme every week, and other useful resources, as well, of course, as a reminder about what the podcast is about. And best of all, this is why it's a safe bet. We don't sell the list, and we never, ever email you more than once a week. So if you join it, you're not going to get a daily email or 3 times a day, once a week. That, dear listeners, is our show for the week. I hope you have gained some insight to help your nonprofit thrive in a competitive environment.
I am not an accountant or attorney, and neither I nor the Goldberg Group provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. This material has been provided for informational purposes only, is not intended to provide, and should not be relied on for tax, legal, or accounting advice. Always consult a qualified, licensed professional about such matters.